Backstage at the Las Vegas Hilton, 1976, Elvis froze. In his trembling hands, a faded wedding photo of him and Priscilla. The crowd outside was chanting his name, but his voice cracked as he whispered something no one was meant to hear. Minutes later, the whole arena felt it too. Las Vegas Hilton, November 14, 1976. Backstage lights flickered against the dressing room mirror, turning his reflection into shards of gold. Outside the heavy doors, a sea of nearly 20,000 fans stamped their feet, chanting one name that still echoed across America: Elvis. He was supposed to walk on stage 5 minutes ago. But Elvis Presley wasn't ready. Not tonight. The room smelled of hairspray, aftershave, and cigarette smoke. The sound of the crowd rolled in waves, like thunder muffled by velvet curtains. Elvis sat on the edge of a small wooden chair, elbows on his knees, a silk scarf twisted between his fingers until the fabric creaked. Beside him stood Charlie Hodge, his longtime friend and stage assistant, holding a water cup that was going cold. The band's tuned," Charlie said softly. Colonel's pacing a hole through the hallway. Elvis didn't answer. He just stared at the floor where an envelope lay. A small, yellowed one marked in blue pen. Memphis, 1967. Charlie frowned. "What's that?" Elvis's fingers brushed the edge of the paper. "Something somebody left for me," he said quietly. His voice trembled. Not from fear of the stage, but from something older, deeper. He slipped a thumb under the flap and pulled it open. Inside was a photograph. The noise of the audience seemed to fade. Even the air conditioner stopped humming. For a long moment he didn't move. Then the light caught the corner of the glossy paper, and Charlie saw it too. Elvis and Priscilla, dressed in white, smiling before a sea of flashbulbs. Their wedding day. 9 years ago, same city, different world. Elvis swallowed hard. "I thought I'd burned the last one," he murmured. Charlie glanced toward the door. "You want me to take it away?" Elvis shook his head. "No. It found its way back for a reason." He turned the photo over and froze again. On the back, written in Priscilla's handwriting, were the words, "Do you remember who you promised to be?" For a moment he forgot the crowd, the contracts, the rhinestones. He was 20-something again, standing at the altar, promising forever while cameras clicked like heartbeats. His chest tightened. He could almost smell her perfume. Almost hear her whisper, "Don't change too much. Okay?" Outside, the announcer's voice boomed, "Ladies and gentlemen, the one and only Elvis Presley." The crowd erupted. But Elvis didn't move. He stared at the photo, thumb tracing the corner until it smeared. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, lost somewhere between memory and regret. Charlie tried again. You okay?" Elvis blinked, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Tell him I'll be a minute." The applause faded into a confused murmur. The band stalled, vamping the intro. Somewhere in the hallway, Colonel Parker's voice barked orders. But Elvis barely heard it. He lifted the photo to the mirror. 2 versions of himself stared back. The man in the picture, young and bright, and the man holding it now, heavier, tired, shadowed by fame. Which one was real? And which one had he lost along the way? He whispered. "She said I'd forget." Guess she was right. The mirror lights buzzed. One of them flickered out with a faint pop. Charlie set down the cup. "They're waiting." Elvis took a deep breath and folded the photo carefully, tucking it inside the pocket of his white jumpsuit. "Then they'll wait with me," he said quietly. "Just a little longer." He stood, straightened his collar, and for a heartbeat the room seemed to still, as if the entire hotel was holding its breath. The faint rumble of the crowd filtered through the curtain again. 20,000 people ready to worship a man who suddenly wasn't sure who he was anymore. Elvis turned toward the stage entrance. But instead of stepping through, he reached back, touched the pocket over his heart, and closed his eyes. Somewhere in that silence you could almost hear it. The sound of a promise trying to find its way home. What would you have done if the past walked back into your hands like that? Would you go out and sing? Or stop to listen first? Elvis opened his eyes, whispering to no one, "For her." Then the lights outside dimmed, the stage crew tensed, and the curtain rope began to move. The king took one slow breath, and everything changed. The curtain trembled as the crowd began to chant his name again. Elvis! 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 Each cheer hit the walls like waves. But backstage, the king still stood frozen, his pulse beating louder than the drums on stage. He opened his palm. The photo glimmered under the fluorescent light, edges cracked, corners soft. A single fingerprint smudged Priscilla's white dress. He traced her face with his thumb. The note on the back echoed through him. Do you remember who you promised to be? That line wasn't a question, it was a mirror that showed everything fame had stolen. 9 years ago, that promise had felt easy. He was in love. He was unstoppable. The world danced when he sang. But somewhere between the stadium lights and the sleeping pills, between the stage smiles and the lonely nights, he'd forgotten the sound of sincerity. Now, this one photograph carried all of it. The love, the loss, the cost of being Elvis Presley. He sat back down, elbows on his knees. Charlie Hodge watched him carefully. You sure you're all right? Elvis let out a faint laugh. Charlie, I've been singing for everyone else so long. I forgot who the first song was for. His heart raced like the first night he'd ever performed. Only this time, the stakes weren't about fame or failure. They were about a 6-year-old girl seeing the truth behind the legend. The crowd started to murmur. Someone coughed. Still, he stood frozen, microphone trembling in his hand. From the balcony, Lisa's eyes widened. She didn't move. The entire arena felt suspended between two heartbeats. Then he smiled. Small, private, real. He took a step closer to the front edge of the stage. The light followed him. And softly, into the mic, he said, "Y'all excuse me a moment." The crowd chuckled, thinking it was a joke. But his tone wasn't playful, it was tender. He raised his eyes again, straight to her. It was like time rewound, back to when she was a baby reaching for him through a crib's wooden bars. He felt every mile, every missed birthday, every letter he'd written but never sent. For a man who had sung to millions, he suddenly realized this was the only audience that mattered. Charlie caught on. He nodded to the band, signaling them to stay still. No one played a note. The only sound was the faint hiss of the stage monitors and the shallow breaths of 20,000 strangers watching something they couldn't quite explain. Elvis lowered the mic from his lips and whispered something to himself. Some fans close enough to the stage later swore they heard it. "There you are, baby." A shiver ran through the crowd. They didn't know what it meant, but they could feel it. He motioned toward the band again, a subtle gesture. Glenn's fingers hovered, uncertain. Elvis leaned in, whispering something none of them expected. Then he turned back to the crowd, voice steady now. "We're gonna do something different." That line would later appear on dozens of bootleg tapes. Fans replayed it over and over, wondering what had happened in that exact second. The second when Elvis Presley, the unstoppable showman, broke the script. From the balcony, Lisa's lips curved into a small smile. He'd seen her. And now the whole world would witness what came next. The air in the Hilton room changed. Even the flashing cameras seemed to hesitate, waiting for his next move. What would you do if the moment you longed for, years of silence, distance, and guilt, arrived in front of 20,000 people? Would you keep pretending, or risk it all for a single song of truth? Elvis turned back toward the bandstand, jaw tight, eyes bright under the lights. The crowd waited. No one dared to clap. Glenn Harden stared at him from the piano, eyebrows raised. The next song on the set list was Suspicious Minds. But Elvis shook his head slowly. Then he whispered something that made Glenn's hands freeze over the keys. "You'll never walk alone." It wasn't on the schedule. It wasn't rehearsed. And yet, in that instant, everyone in the band knew better than to question him. Elvis stepped forward. The spotlight followed, leaving the rest of the stage in gentle darkness. His white jumpsuit shimmered like glass under the heat. He gripped the microphone with both hands, knuckles pale. The first piano chord echoed through the hall, soft, hesitant, trembling. The crowd leaned in. He began to sing. "When you walk through a storm, Hold your head up high. The words rolled out like a prayer. His voice wasn't smooth this time. It cracked on the edges, like something breaking open. In the balcony, Lisa leaned so far forward Joe Esposito had to catch her sleeve. Her eyes sparkled with tears she didn't understand yet. Down below, the audience went silent. The brass players watched him instead of their charts. The backup singers lowered their mics. It felt like everyone in that room was watching something sacred happen. Halfway through the second verse, his voice shook. He pressed a hand to his chest, took a breath and steadied himself. No one spoke. No one even blinked. Then he looked up, straight at her. That glance carried every word he couldn't say out loud. Every missed bedtime. Every apology left unspoken. For once, the king wasn't performing. He was confessing. The camera flashes stopped. Even the security guards forgot to move. A fan later said, "It was like he stopped being famous and started being human." When he reached the line, "Walk on, through the wind," his voice broke. The crowd gasped. But instead of hiding it, he smiled, small, soft, proud. He wanted her to see that even the strongest voices sometimes tremble. Lisa raised her tiny hand and waved. For a split second, the light caught her, and thousands of people turned their heads toward the balcony. Elvis saw it. He nodded slightly, just enough for her to know. And then he sang the final lines, slow and gentle. "And you'll never walk alone." The last note hung in the air, pure and trembling. For 3 full seconds, nobody made a sound. Then eruption. A roar unlike anything the Hilton had ever heard. People stood, clapping, crying, shouting his name. Some threw flowers. Others just held each other. The king bowed once, eyes glistening. He whispered into the mic, barely audible, "That one was for my little girl." The words rippled through the room like lightning. The audience froze, realizing who had been watching all along. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras scrambled to find the balcony. But the small figure was already gone, led away by Joe before the flashbulbs could steal the moment. Elvis stayed on stage, hands still on the mic, eyes lingering on the spot where she'd been. He looked smaller then. Not the icon, the man. The orchestra started to rise for the next number, but he waved them off. He needed silence. The crowd gave it to him. What would you have done? Would you go back to the set list? Or let the world see your heart? For a heartbeat, it was pure silence. Not the kind of silence that means nothing. This one was heavy, real. Felt like the world had exhaled. Then the sound came. A wave of applause, crashing from the front row to the rafters. 20,000 people on their feet, clapping until their palms burned. Some were crying. Some were shouting. But no one really knew why. They just felt it. Elvis stood perfectly still at center stage, breathing hard, shoulders trembling under the white suit. He wiped his face with the edge of his sleeve. When he lowered his hand, there were tears on it. Cameras flashed again, catching the glint. The tabloids would call it sweat. But the people who were there, they knew the truth. He looked up once more, toward the balcony. The light was gone now. Lisa Marie had been led out by Joe, safe from the reporters. Still, Elvis stared into that empty space as if she were still there. He raised the mic and whispered, "Thank you." The crowd roared louder. But the thank you wasn't for them. Down below, Charlie Hodge turned to Glenn Harden. "You see that?" he murmured. Glenn just nodded. Yeah, he saw her. Backstage, the crew watched the monitors in silence. One cameraman, years later, said he'd never forgotten it. It was like he'd seen a ghost and a miracle all at once. Elvis motioned to the band to start "Can't Help Falling in Love" again, the song he'd paused before everything changed. The familiar melody filled the room, but it sounded different now. Softer, slower, more fragile. He wasn't singing for the crowd anymore. He was finishing a conversation he'd started years ago, when she was too little to remember. When he reached the final chorus, he didn't stretch the notes or flash a grin. He simply let the sound fade, his voice cracking once more before the applause came crashing back. Reporters later estimated the standing ovation lasted 3 full minutes. Some said it was the longest in Hilton history, and when it finally ended, he didn't do an encore. He didn't take a bow. He just whispered one line into the mic, "Good night, and God bless." Then he walked off stage. The audience remained standing long after he disappeared behind the curtain. It wasn't just a concert anymore. It had become a confession shared by thousands. Charlie met him backstage, towel in hand. "You okay, E?" Elvis nodded, but his voice shook. "She was here, Charlie. My baby was here." Charlie placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know." Elvis looked down at his scarf, the one he hadn't thrown to the crowd. He folded it neatly and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Later, he'd leave it on Lisa's pillow at Graceland. That night, long after the last limousine left the Hilton, a handful of fans lingered by the doors. They didn't take pictures. They just stood there whispering about what they'd seen. One woman said, "He sang like a man trying to reach heaven before his daughter left the room." The last word barely left his lips before the crowd erupted. But he didn't bow. He didn't smile. He just turned his head slightly, whispering something again. Something softer, swallowed by the music. A nearby microphone caught it faintly. "I still do, Scylla." No one in the hall realized it, but a fan's bootleg recorder near the third row caught every word. That tape would later leak through collectors and spread online decades later. The whisper that proved even kings can break. Back on stage, the ovation thundered. People rose to their feet, waving scarves and flashing cameras. The noise was deafening, but Elvis didn't hear it. His face was wet, eyes distant, lost somewhere the crowd couldn't follow. Charlie stepped out from the wings, unsure whether to comfort him or let him stand there alone. The colonel was gone. Stormed out the side exit after realizing this wasn't the show he wanted. But the fans didn't care. They had just seen something that felt holy. Elvis took one step back, then another. The lights dimmed to blue. He turned, slowly walking off stage. The applause didn't fade. It grew louder, as if the crowd could somehow call him back. But he didn't return. Behind the curtain, he leaned against the wall, breathing hard, head bowed. Charlie caught up to him. "E, what was that out there?" Elvis smiled faintly, voice barely a whisper. "The truth." He reached into his pocket, pulled out the folded photograph, and stared at it once more. The edges were damp from sweat. The ink from her handwriting had bled just enough to blur the word promised. He traced it with his thumb and whispered again. "I kept it, Scylla. I did." Charlie didn't ask what he meant. He didn't have to. The sound of the crowd seeped through the curtain again, a roar fading into an echo. For a moment, it sounded less like applause and more like waves pulling away from shore. The roar of the Hilton crowd still echoed down the hall long after Elvis disappeared behind the curtain. Outside, they were shouting for an encore, but backstage silence ruled. Elvis sat on a worn leather couch, head down, the white jumpsuit gleaming under a single buzzing light. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded the photograph again. The ink was smudged now, the corner bent from the heat of the stage. Charlie Hodge sat across from him, watching. "You want me to tell him you're done?" he asked quietly. Elvis nodded without looking up. "Let him go home happy," he said. His voice was soft, cracked, like someone who'd been awake for years. Charlie hesitated. "They'll say you're sick again, or tired." Elvis smiled weakly. "Let em. Truth is, I remembered something I thought I lost." He placed the photo carefully on the small coffee table. It looked tiny against the leather grain, a moment from a life that didn't belong to him anymore. Outside, the sound crew began winding cables. One of them, a young tech named Billy, walked past holding a reel-to-reel tape marked Hilton Set Number 44. None of them knew it yet, but that reel would carry something far more valuable than a set list. Because just before the last note faded, one of the backup mics near the front row had stayed open. It picked up the faint whisper right before Elvis left the stage. 5 words no one in the room had caught. "I still do, Scylla." It was clear, trembling, and heartbreakingly sincere. The next day, a fan named Maria Lopez, who'd been recording the show on a small portable cassette deck, played her tape back in a hotel room across town. When she turned the volume up, she froze. The whisper was right there, soft, honest, unmistakable. She mailed the tape to a local radio host. 2 weeks later, it aired quietly at midnight on KLOS 98.5 under the segment Moments You Missed. By morning, every fan club in America was talking about it. Some said it was fake. Others swore they heard it live. The press picked it up. Headlines appeared across tabloids. Elvis's whisper of love. Did the king speak to his lost queen? Colonel Parker called it nonsense. But Charlie knew better. He'd seen the look in Elvis's eyes. That wasn't rumor, that was confession. When Elvis came in for rehearsal the next day, he barely said a word. He carried the same envelope in his jacket pocket. A stagehand overheard him humming under his breath. It wasn't one of his hits, it was Love Me Tender. Reporters tried to get a quote. He smiled politely, signed a few autographs, and said only, "Some songs don't end when you stop singing." A week later, the whisper had spread beyond Vegas. Bootleg copies of Maria's tape circulated through fan clubs in Nashville, Chicago, and even London. Collectors labeled it the Whisper of '76. And for the first time in years, fans didn't talk about the jumpsuits or the money or the tours. They talked about the man, the husband, the human being who still loved someone he'd lost. Priscilla never commented publicly. But years later, her assistant revealed something quietly in a 1980 interview. She received a white scarf in the mail. No note, just his scent, just the past. That was all she said. And that was all anyone needed to know. Some stories don't need proof. They live because people feel they're true. The Hilton staff kept that bootleg tape in their archives for decades. When the hotel was renovated, a small plaque appeared near the old stage doors. It read, November 14th, 1976, the night the king remembered love. Fans still leave flowers there every year. Some bring copies of the photo. Others just stand quietly, listening to the echoes through the hall. If you go late enough at night, when the crowd's gone and the lights are low, the sound system hums with an old recording. Faint, fragile, a single voice whispering through static. I still do, Scylla. And if you listen closely, you'll feel it too. That mix of love and loss that only Elvis could turn into a prayer. Because sometimes, legends don't live forever in the charts. They live forever in the spaces between words, in the whispers we almost missed. August 16th, 1977, Memphis, Tennessee. The world woke up to headlines that didn't seem real. Elvis Presley dead at 42. Radio stations went silent between songs. Fans stood outside Graceland crying as if they'd lost someone they knew personally. In a way, they had. Inside the mansion, amid flowers and telegrams, Priscilla walked slowly down the hallway toward his bedroom. She hadn't been here in months. The air still carried the faint scent of his cologne, that mix of leather, tobacco, and memory. On the bedside table sat a single picture frame. Inside it, their wedding photo, the same one. But on the back, written in Elvis's unmistakable blue ink scrawl, were 2 words, I remember. Priscilla pressed her hand over her mouth. She didn't cry at first. She just stood there, letting the truth sink in. Even after all the noise, all the fame, all the distance, he hadn't forgotten. That night, when the family gathered in the living room, she placed the frame gently beside his guitar. No one said a word. They didn't have to. Weeks later, as the Hilton prepared a tribute concert, staff discovered a small box in his dressing room. Inside, a neatly folded scarf, a ticket stub from the November 14th, 1976 show, and a handwritten note addressed simply, to her. They never released what the note said, only that it ended with his initials, EP. The Hilton later mounted a brass plaque backstage, just beside the door he'd walked through that night. It read, The night the king remembered love. To this day, fans still stop there. Some leave scarves, others whisper prayers, and every once in a while, someone plays that old bootleg on a small speaker, the one where, beneath the applause, you can hear him whisper the words that broke every heart in the room. I still do, Scylla. It's faint, fragile, but it's their proof that even legends ache like the rest of us. Maybe that's why his music still hits different. Because behind every note was a man who remembered love, even when it hurt to. Sometimes the loudest promises aren't the ones made in front of cameras. They're the ones whispered when no one is supposed to hear. And somewhere in that silence, between the crowd's last cheer and the hum of an empty stage, the king finally found peace. They say Elvis Presley was larger than life, but in the end it wasn't the fame, the records, or the rhinestones people remembered. It was a whisper, that quiet moment behind the curtain, when the king of rock and roll stopped being an icon and became just a man, remembering a promise he once made in love, not in glory. Maybe that's what his story was always about. Not the rise, not the fall, but the courage to feel. Every crowd that still sings his songs, every fan that lights a candle on his birthday, they're not just remembering a performer. They're remembering the part of themselves that loved someone and never quite stopped. Because the truth is, every person who's ever lost someone has their own version of that photograph. A memory that still beats beneath everything else. And maybe that's why his voice still feels alive. Because in every lyric, in every whisper, he was really saying what most of us are too scared to. I still do. If the story touched you, share it with someone who still remembers their first love. The one that never truly left. And if you were there that night at the Hilton, tell us what you felt when the king's voice cracked. Some stories fade, but some whispers never do.